Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at some areas of revision for component 1 of A-level EDEXCEL politics coming up in the next week. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on the topics that weren't in the advanced information for 2022. It does not necessarily mean they'll be on in 2023, but it at least gives us a little area to concentrate on. Obviously, all the other stuff, again, there's loads and loads and loads of stuff. So anything that was in the advanced information in 2022, I did a video last year which looks at all the stuff in the advanced information. So this kind of essentially adds on to that and fills any potential gaps. So just a reminder of what the paper will look like in part A. You'll have a choice of 2 source questions which are worth 30 marks. In part B you have a choice of 2 30-mark essays. Again, so in first part A and part B you just do one of the choices. In part C you have a choice of 2 essays. Now they could be on liberalism, socialism or conservatism. Last year it was socialism and conservatism, which means, and I'll look at liberalism later on, means it's more likely. There's a lot of debate, I think, among students and teachers on this in terms of what the format is in that last section. Will it definitely be one of one ideology and one of another? I'm not sure that is 100% guaranteed. My students often ask me, can I get away with just revising one ideology, to which the answer is definitively no. They ask, can I get away with only revising 2 ideologies, and I say I wouldn't do that either. I would advise revising all 3, because they may at some point decide to put 2 questions on the same ideology on a paper. They have never done so. That doesn't necessarily mean that they won't. So the first area that was not on the advanced information last year was democracy and participation. And you can see an address for the video I've made on this particular area, which you may well have watched already, or hopefully you've watched already. If you haven't done so, go watch that video as well. And the spec tells us that we need to know the features of direct democracy and representative democracy, similarities and differences between direct democracy and representative democracy, the advantages and disadvantages of direct democracy and representative democracy, and consideration of the case for reform. So one of the other areas that wasn't on last year was referendums. And so obviously, in terms of, if you then want to write about UK examples of stuff, which they're going to expect you to do because this is a UK politics paper, then linking this with the referendum section makes sense. But I would make sure as a starting point that you've got notes and flashcards or whatever it is that you do covering those 3 bullet points, so that you could, if required, explain what direct democracy was, what representative democracy was, how they differ, how they're the same. And then the advantages and disadvantages of them. Again, I suggest go to that previous video for that kind of stuff. I think you need to think about how well representative democracy works in the UK. This links to ideas such as turnout. Now things have improved since 2001, which was kind of the all-time low, but they're still not great compared to historical levels. It links in with voting systems, so things like first past the post, which leads to a party with a minority of the vote having a majority of the seats. And our system of representative democracy in the UK and the way it works, having meant that in recent times we've had 2 new prime ministers without a general election. So the idea of the kind of representative democracy, when you have a party leader who and a prime minister who has a lot of power, but they're not directly elected in the way that, say, for example, a president is in the US. And that causes a number of issues. So there are problems with representative democracy in the UK. I mean, you could also link it with other areas. You could talk about the fact that we have an unelected chamber in the House of Lords. You could link it to ideas in terms of the different theories on representation. So the idea of whether the idea of MP should just directly pass on the views of their constituents, or whether they should, having been elected, they don't have to worry they just make their own judgment. So which of those kind of theories you think works and is used? and think also about some of the issues created by uses of direct democracy in the UK, where we have had referendums. I mean, that's not always gone enormously smoothly, notably Brexit. And so there are lots of interesting issues within this. They're unlikely to ask you a direct question like evaluate the differences between direct and representative democracy, because then it doesn't really give you a context to bring in loads of examples. But you need to have the underlying knowledge so you can apply it to whatever they do ask you. So things to think about in terms of democracy and participation is to think about the relevant UK information. So this could be the clash between direct democracy and representative democracy over Brexit, the impact of direct democracy in helping shift in representative democracy with the IndieRef in Scotland, which led to and saw a significant rise in the SNP. So we had some direct democracy, which was the IndieRef, and then following that we saw a shift in representative democracy in Scotland, with the SNP becoming by far and away the biggest party and doing really well, not only in general elections but in the Scottish parliamentary elections. Interesting bit where we see this interaction between direct and representative democracy in the UK is the use of petitions that lead to parliamentary debate. So these kind of official petitions that you can create and or sign on the government web pages, where with 10,000 signatures the government will respond to the petition. At 100,000 signatures it will be considered for a debate. There have been 163 of these debates so far. So, for example, there's a debate in May 2021 on free school meals after a petition kind of inspired by some of the work of Marcus Rashford led to 1.1 million signatures. So in that we can see it comes a connection between direct and representative democracy. And you could argue that in this way that direct democracy or forms of direct democracy are enriching the representative democracy in the UK, although it just makes the government respond, it just makes Parliament debate it, it doesn't actually ensure they're actually going to make any changes. But it's a representative democracy, so if they ignore the will of the people, they should, in theory, suffer the consequences when the next election comes along. Looking at some stuff from outside the UK, again, because we aren't a direct democracy, we are a representative democracy. There are other bits of direct democracy that we've seen above, notably referendums, but a good point of reference is Switzerland, where direct democracy is well established and turnout is reasonably good. But there are examples of direct democracy in Switzerland damaging minority rights. So, for example, preventing the building of further mosques, denying some significant immigrant groups within Switzerland citizenship. There's also been stuff in relation to Jewish religious practices and things in the past. So the important bit of that is the ability to show that maybe the direct democracy is not some kind of pure democratic panacea, and that it may well cause problems, and it links actually with liberalism, with the idea of the tyranny of the majority. You could also, if you go links all the way back to kind of OG democracy, go all the way back to Athenian democracy in the ancient world. That led to demagogues, where these were kind of strong speakers who appealed to populist ideals, and it led to Athens having, for example, an aggressive foreign policy. And there are figures like Cleon and Alcibiades and things like that going back to the time of the Peloponnesian War, and they kind of pushed these ideas, which were really quite extreme. And so there is this idea that the way that the population can be swung around by demagogues, and you might relate that again, if you want to relate back to the UK, you could maybe relate that back to Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson in the time of the Brexit debate. The kind of the populist appeal, populist speakers on that side, which kind of the other side in a way was lacking. Now, if we move on to the next bit, this is one where I think there's often lots of questions asked by students. I know my students have looked at this and are going, right, well, this is the one that wasn't on the advance information last year, the wider franchise and debate over suffrage, key milestones in winding the franchise, and then we go in relation to class, gender, ethnicity and age. So we go back to the 1832 Great Reform Act, the 1918 and 1928 Representation of the People's Act, and then also in 1969 when the voting age was dropped to 18. There's a bullet point on the work of suffragists and suffragettes, and then one on the current movement to extend the franchise. Right. This is Alan, history nerd. I'm a history teacher in origin, as well as teaching politics and other things. So to me, I get very excited by the first two bullet points on that. But they are history questions, really, to me. If they were to ask directly on those, rather than politics ones, in such that there may well be students out there who are studying units on UK politics, particularly on UK history. So notably, there's an AQA unit that runs from 1851 through to 1964, which is a really interesting unit. Tom and I wrote a book on it. It's got lots of good stuff. I get very excited by things like the growth of the franchise. It is really, really important. I think you need to know it, but you need to know it as context, in the idea that the franchise is not a fixed thing, that at different points in history, and you could then bring these examples in, people have debated whether the franchise should change, and then you can apply this to questions about the franchise as it is now and whether it should be moved further in any particular direction, and that might involve looking at things like class, gender, ethnicity, age. Now, most of that has kind of been settled. The age is one of the few ones that remains. So the kind of things you're likely to end up talking about on this is evaluate the view that the next logical step in widening of the franchise is 16-year-olds being given the vote. And again, there's been some good materials and stuff on that produced by the board, and it might well be an issue or something you've written an essay on in class. And evaluate the view that 9 votes of prisoners goes against their fundamental rights, which connects this bit of widening the franchise to another bit of Unit 1. They quite like doing stuff like this. It combines it to another bit of Unit 1 on rights, and so that would be, again, another one that they could look at. Now, I've done videos before, and in those I've looked at stuff like 16-year-olds given the vote, and there's lots of interesting stuff in there. So there's lots of things that you can do at 16 and 17, which means that whoever's in government is quite significant to you. There's the idea that it would empower young people. There's a really good example in Scotland with the vote being given to 16 and 17-year-olds, and that actually increased political engagement. And that political engagement, we end up with really high turnout going through, and it particularly, in a way, I think, increased the turnout of the 18 to 24 age group, which is notoriously the worst for turnout in the UK and elsewhere. And we can talk about the younger generation, Gen Z, being particularly politically aware and engaged through things like online social media, and we see kind of movements with the young people are particularly passionate about, some things to do with identity politics, stuff to do with the environment, and a whole range of issues. And so you could go on this that, well, actually there is a political awakening, and so the 16 and 17-year-olds are the equivalent of the 18-year-olds from 1969, or the other times when the franchise has changed. Now, there is a counter to this. I mean, and I've seen some quite a bit of stuff written on this where actually 16 and 17-year-olds are, in inverted commas, younger than 16 and 17-year-olds used to be in the past, so they are still children. So it's things like, yes, we used to have a voting age of we've had a voting age of 18 for a long time, but we had a school leaving age of 15, 16. Now we're going to say, oh, maybe we should give 16 and 17-year-olds a vote, but we have education ending at 18, and then actually for getting on for half of the people of that age group, they then go on to university. So the idea that we have financially independent out in the world 18 to 21-year-olds is debatable, let alone 16 and 17-year-olds. So there's a strong counter there. Also, it's not like the amount of people voting in the bracket above 18 to 24 is really knocking on the door saying young people are desperate to vote. The argument about kind of knowledge is an interesting one, because you can say, well, okay, they don't know much about it, we shouldn't give them the vote. But you could counter that by going, okay, well, they don't know much about it, let's do something about politics education in schools, and try and improve that, or politics education in general public campaigns and things like that. There is an argument that young people are more likely to be taken in by fake news and extreme politics, maybe vote for joke candidates. And again, it's a point that is made. I'm not sure how strong it is. Again, if I put my history hat on, evidence would suggest, well, if you look back at periods of indoctrination, then younger people were more likely to be taken in. But I think in the post-truth era in which we live, I think maybe you can argue that people across the age range are susceptible to that stuff at the moment. So the prisoners one is an interesting one. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you connect it up with rights. So in this, you would be weighing up things like the rights of prisoners versus the rights of their victims, the rights of victims of crime, and the rights of, for example, there's a particular bit where you could talk about you've got law-abiding citizens who live in a particular constituency. The constituency has a really large prison in it. Is that going to kind of shift the vote in that area? You could argue that it does fundamentally deny people's rights, but you could say this is okay, actually, because it matches the will of the people. So the idea of prisoners getting the vote is not a popular one. Again, it's an interesting one. I don't know whether it's one we've debated in my classroom. It's maybe one that other people have debated as well. And generally speaking, I don't get overwhelming numbers of students who go, all prisoners should have the right to vote. And I should imagine this will be repeated across society. And particularly, normally there are particular categories of prisoners that they don't want to give the vote to. The counter to that is that it's a fundamental right. So you might not like it, but fundamental rights should not be touched regardless of public opinion. And you run into then this kind of slippery slope argument. Well, if it's okay to deny the right to vote to prisoners, is it okay to do some of the stuff that happens in a lot of states in America, to deny the right to vote to felons even after they're out of prison? So again, there is some good arguments in there. There's kind of lots of stuff in there about, you could talk about in terms of rehabilitation, about disconnecting prisoners from the rest of society and treating them differently. I don't think, I haven't seen a study on this, but I can't imagine anyone's ever gone, I was going to commit a load of crime and then I didn't because I realised I would lose my right to vote. I don't think it works in that kind of way. And again, there's some bits and bobs above me, but it's another interesting debate. It links rights, which is part of component one, with the franchise, which is part of component one. So in that, I think it would be a nice area for a question. Doesn't necessarily mean, unfortunately, that there will be. Political parties, this is one of those ones that's always a bit of a headache for teachers and students alike, because the parties and stuff keeps changing in terms of the bit on policies and all that kind of stuff. Now that isn't the missing bit. The missing bit this time is this bit here: the functions and features of political parties in the UK. And how parties are currently funded, and debate on consequences of the funding system. The second one in particular, I think, is a particularly nice area, or particularly kind of juicy question area, I think. So you could, on the first one, you could have something along the lines of, to what extent do political parties no longer adequately fulfil their functions? And the second one, evaluate the view that current funding system in the UK is damaging to democracy. Again, then you're linking a debate on the current funding system to a broader theme in the unit on democracy. So on the first one, the main thing you would have to do is go through the different functions and decide whether the political parties are still meeting these. So on policy making, Labour Party, for example, does it on the conference. One example of that is Conference voted in favour of introducing proportional representation. This hasn't really then made it onto the agenda in terms of party leadership. In policy making, we've seen in the Conservative parties, we've seen some rather radical shifts under recent leaders, notably Truss. And so you can say, well, how good is their policy making? Because they don't seem to fulfil that function very well as a party as a whole, because their policy was one thing, then it was something completely different, and then they kind of went back to how it was before the radically different bit. So that doesn't look very good, doing a very good job of policy making. We've also seen examples where policy seems to kind of be forced on leaders by backbenchers or external pressures. And one of the most common given examples of that is Cameron and his referendum on the EU. As Cameron, we know, campaigned against Brexit and didn't really want the referendum in the first place, but it was something he needed to see off UKIP and keep his backbenchers happy. Representation, well, one of the bits I would talk about that is the very small number of members. So particularly, for example, the Conservative Party, our government, have got about 160,000 members, and we saw that then when they were choosing their leader recently. The number, well, one of the times they were selecting leaders recently and it went to the vote, there's not an enormous number of people voting and choosing the Prime Minister. We could talk about representation within the end of partisan alignment. We talk about the end of class alignment. We could talk about the end of regional alignment. For example, all those gaping holes in the red wall that appeared in 2019. We could talk about the rise of populist parties like UKIP and the Brexit Party. And we've got the rise of nationalist parties into representing views on independence. There's lots of people, and you could then also link into things like turnout, where there's lots of people who no longer feel an attachment to, and this is the end of partisan alignment. They don't feel attached to a particular party. They don't feel a particular party represents them, and this would link into probably the most controversial bit on the last year's paper, where they talked about pick and mix politics in one of the sources. And the idea of this is that people aren't kind of, I'm Labour, whatever Labour say, I like that bit of Labour, and I like that bit of the Conservatives, and I like that bit by the Liberals, and I like that bit by the SNP, and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of bit where people aren't connected. So you could argue in that, well, how good a job do they do in representation? You talk about seats where parties win by a very, very long way, and you can say, well, actually, they're going to that MP there is likely to be in line with most of the constituents. And then there's one, so for example, Sheffield Hallam in the last election, the Labour candidate that won got about 35% of the vote. So how representative can they be of an area where they have such a small percentage of the vote? On selecting candidates, there's lots of controversy. So, for example, Labour trying to not select Corbyn, and we're seeing kind of conflict there in between national and local level. There's the old age one of the National Party kind of parachuting candidates in to local areas where there's not much of a connection. There's debate about all women shortlists. So again, selecting candidates, you can talk about whether they're doing a good or bad one. Again, if I go back to an old Sheffield Hallam one, so there's been some quite controversial ones there, with former MP ending up facing kind of criminal prosecutions, and you could argue that there wasn't necessarily the tightest of the most detailed looking into the candidates before they were selected. Identifying leaders, again, we've had a merry-go-round at the top of the Conservative Party. So Liz Truss, you could argue, represented party members. They chose her, but failed due to lack of support from her own MPs and generally from the public. So we see that it's not necessarily the greatest success, or the parties don't necessarily have the greatest record in success in choosing their leaders. On the other side, you could talk about Corbyn, who was much loved by many in the party, but not seen as a credible leader by the media and the majority of the population. So you could say, well, maybe they don't do a great job of picking leaders. There was a bit where people kind of go, yes, but they chose Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson was a good leader until he wasn't. and all the stuff over Partygate and things like that. So again, the selecting candidates and identifying leaders linked together is well, how good a choices are the political parties making in these areas. So this next bit, looking at the current funding system, well, how is it done? It's donations, it's membership subscriptions, it's public funds. You need to know the key bits of regulation. So the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act of 2000, which talks about registering donations, restricting spending on elections. The Political Parties and Election Act of 2009, which restricted donations from non-UK residents and tightened regulations in the run-up to elections. And notably on this, for example, the Conservative Party were fined £70,000 for breaches in 2017. But there still seems to be some fairly significant problems. So we still get large donations to the Conservative Party results in honours scandals like that. We get the Conservatives, the fact that Conservatives receive significant donations from wealthy individuals, hedge funds, and property companies. Does this then impact on the policies that they pursue? And some people would argue, yes, it does, and this is elite influence, and it kind of is damaging democracy. The Labour Party can say, well, it's still tied to the unions, but it is becoming less reliant on the unions as its funding model shifts. Other parties, the smaller parties, you could argue can't compete, notably the Liberal Democrats. We've seen the SNP in enormous financial issues at the moment, though that might be to do with the way they're keeping their books rather than the lack of money. The Conservatives outspent Labour 2-1 in the 2019 election, and you can kind of go, well, which party won? Well, the party won that spent the most money. That seems like a bit of a problem. There was a report in 2007 known as the Phillips Report, which looked at strengthening democracy, fair and sustainable funding of political parties, and what Phillips suggested was state funding based on vote share and party membership. So that would take away some of the stuff in terms of the idea that there's corruption in the donations and hidden influence of the groups or individuals who are backing political parties, and it would make the playing field more equal. But this is not a popular idea with taxpayers, and particularly the idea that a lot of taxpayers dislike is the idea of their money being spent on behalf of political parties they particularly dislike. There's the issue of, well, how do you work out the funding? Well, if you do it on previous results, then you're just going to build in advantage. So the party that wins election A then receives more funding than the other parties going into election B, and therefore you could build in advantage, and therefore it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of the struggle to get funding from the smaller parties. And there's also the worry that essentially we then just combine, we connect the parties too strongly into the state, and the parties just become organs of the state, and the idea of kind of influence and things and ideas of dramatic change kind of go, because the parties are dependent no longer on donations or corporations or trade unions. They're reliant on the state, and therefore the state becomes an institution that they won't change or attack because they're relying on it for their money. So, as I've already mentioned, one of the other areas missing from 2022 was referendums and how they're used. So, again, how referendums have been used in the UK and their impact on UK political life since '97, the case for and against referendums in a representative democracy, which links into the connection that we saw earlier between direct and representative democracy. So here's some essential questions that I came up with. So, to what extent have referendums enriched democracy in the UK since '97? Evaluate the view that more frequent use of referendums is needed in the UK as political parties fail to represent the views of the people. So, connecting political parties with referendums there. The enriched democracy one would link it in with direct democracy. So, to what extent have referendums enriched democracy in the UK since '97? Well, we've seen high levels of engagement, in particularly in the Scottish independence referendum, where you saw turnout over 80%. It was over 70% in the Brexit vote. So both of these were well in excess in the numbers that we're seeing in general elections. So this would suggest that democratically, these have been enriching. People have engaged. There was certainly a lot of media coverage of both of those. There was lots of debate and argument amongst the population on them. So in that, you could say, well, yeah, people are angry, but at least they are talking about politics. They are engaged. You could talk about devolution. So the referendums that led to devolution has moved decision making closer to the people. So you could say, well, the UK's the quality of democracy in the UK, you could say, has improved since '97. One of the reasons why it's improved is because of devolution, and these decisions being made in Wales and in Scotland on things that affect them, and then also we see got the city regions and all those kind of things. And in that you can say, well, more decisions being made closer to the people is democratically good. How did we get there? We got there through referendums. So that kind of stands up on that one. You can talk about referendums cutting across party lines. So things have happened that wouldn't have happened because there wasn't a political party or one of the main political bodies saying we are going to do this. So again, so what you then get is a more pure form of democracy, the will of the people. And again, you could use Brexit for that. So there wasn't a clear line, was there, to start off with from either political party. So there was the Conservatives that introduced the referendum, but their leader campaigned against it. The Labour Party were also divided. And so what we get to is the will of the people, but we don't get there through representative democracy and the political parties. You can argue that the referendums are actually damaging and that they've caused an enormous number of problems, and partly that may because they are overly simplifying politics, giving binary choices. So, for example, do you want to leave the EU? Well, the answer said yes, but then people argued it was, and there was also then arguments about the democratic need for a second referendum to confirm the decision that was made. So yes, you wanted to leave the EU. Did you want to leave the EU on these terms? And we kind of ended up with a mix, didn't we? Because we had the Brexit referendum that said they would leave, and then really the 2019 election in a way became kind of a referendum on whether people backed Boris's deal, but actually the Conservatives, although they won a majority in the election, they did not get a majority of the vote. So if you added the Tory vote and the Brexit UKIP vote together, it didn't break 50% anywhere near. So therefore, if you'd done it as a second referendum, the result would have been the other way round. So you kind of have a mixture of representative and direct democracy, and so again, you can argue it's unsatisfactory. Brexit and other referendums, Brexit in particular, but other referendums as well, have clashed with parliamentary sovereignty. We've seen there's not quite the level of accountability and strength of legislation really on misleading claims. So sort of misleading claims on the side of a bus during Brexit, and that causes issue. And then linking to one of the things I said earlier, we've seen examples of this in Switzerland, that you end up with the tyranny of the majority. So if you give binary choices, then the people who vote one way will be happy, and the people who vote the other way will be unhappy. And this has led to divides and problems in UK society and politics. One of the other bits that's missing is the case studies. Now, this is one where they're not going to be a direct case study question, I don't think. But what it does is it gives you the background and the information to answer questions on electoral systems, and particularly on voting behaviour and about election campaigns and political parties and all those kind of bits and pieces. So you need to make sure that you have 3 case studies. One where you've looked at an election of somewhere between 1945 and 1992. So, for example, in my college, we always have a tendency to look at the 1979 election, and so you get the stuff on Thatcher coming to power, the Labour isn't working campaign, and all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of interesting stuff in there. Then, obviously, I think whoever's doing the exam writing, spec writing, is possibly of my generation and has the 97 one as a massively important one. First election I ever voted in was 97. So the 97 election, which is the big Labour landslide Blair's first electoral victory, and then they say one since 97. In my college, we tend to do multiple. I mean, there's some that are really important and give you something a bit different, like 2010 when we end up with a coalition government. And then I would always recommend that you have the most recent one, so which means that you will have some good up-to-date examples for anything that you're doing. So I'd highly recommend doing 2019. So make sure you've done that and you've gone through these different bits on here. So the impact of policy and manifesto and campaigning, the impact of different elements of voting behaviour, so class and other factors, voter attachment, partisanship, the areas of gender, age, ethnicity, and how all these influence things. Turnouts, again, an interesting one you can look at. You can look at how turnout dropped and then started increasing again. So a bit of a drop in 2019, but maybe not surprising there was a bit of a drop in 2019 given that the election was in December, whilst it was always in May. And so it's making sure you've got data and stuff like that. So it could come into a broader question on voting behaviour, and then you've got a load of stuff, data from a series of elections to back it up. It could be something about elections or parties or any of that, and this gives you the important bit. And I think the most important bit is that bottom bullet point: analysis of national voting behaviour patterns for these elections revealed by national data sources and how and why they vary. So has the way people vote changed? Now, the last bit I'm going to look at is ideology. The ideology that was missing last year was liberalism. The good news, hopefully, for all of you there, if you're going, yeah, liberalism, go to the channel, look in either the A-level politics playlist or the political ideas playlist, and you will find a whole range of videos on the different ideologies, and on the screen at the moment are all the different ones I've done on liberalism. So how to do the 24-mark question, and then a whole liberalism, the basic, human nature, society, economy, state, the different types, the key thinkers, using the key thinkers in essays. So lots of stuff there that I hope will help you. So if you've not gone back through and over liberalism, that might give you a good starting point. Then on this screen, I just got a load of kind of key ideas that you might want to make sure that you're okay with. The ones that I've put in bold are ones that are linked to the key thinkers. You must use 3 at least of the 5 key thinkers in any essay that you do to reach the higher levels. So make sure you know your Locke, your Wollstonecraft, your Mill, your Rawls, your Friedan to back stuff up. So you've got things like Locke says that within nature there are natural rights, natural liberties, natural laws. He talks about the rationality of humanity, and therefore mechanistic theory, this idea that people are rational and therefore will rationally create a state which is in the best interests of the people. He talks about social contract theory, that the idea that the state can't do what it wants. There's that contract between the people and the government, so between the governing and the governed, which means that they will act responsibly and they will act in the best interests of the people. So you need to know about things like rationalism, about egotistical individualism. So remember, liberalism is based on the ideas of freedom, of individualism, of rationality, and of tolerance. They tolerate of different groups. They believe in meritocracy, so people should rise on their merit, not on, for example, the ideas of birthright, which classical liberals would strongly reject and would continue to be rejected by modern liberals. The modern liberals in particular talk about equality of opportunity. So they would look at the idea that yes, from a base point of classical liberalism, that you should that everybody should have the right to do things, and people should all have the same freedoms. And then in modern liberalism, they kind of go, well, yes, but to exercise those freedoms, we need to ensure there's equality of opportunity. So we might need, at the beginning of a welfare state, we might need things like state education. We might need underlying things to improve people's health. We might need to look at things in terms of Keynesian economics when economies are creating economic movements are creating unemployment rather than individual choices. Wollstonecraft is hugely significant, way ahead of her time. So she writes really important stuff in terms of formal equality. Now, obviously, she's writing directly about this in terms of formal equality for women, but again, the idea of formal equality, the idea that everybody's equal under law, is a hugely important classical liberal theory. She talks about the importance of education, and again, liberals have this really positive view on human nature and this idea that people can get better, and this links with Mill and his idea of developmental individualism. So it's not, people aren't just a sum of what they currently are; they are what their potential, what they could become. And Wollstonecraft talking about education, and so she's a classical liberal, but this kind of links in with ideas later on in terms of equality of opportunity. Classical liberals like a minimal state and laissez-faire economics, and in that way they can contrast with the modern liberals. Again, I've thrown in a couple of bits for some other theorists. So you've got Bentham, who believed that the idea is to create the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people, and that would be the rational thing to do. We've got some classical liberals like Smiles and Spencer, who concentrated more on your egotistical individualism and this idea of self-help and survival of the fittest, and that people should look after themselves and not rely on the state. Now, classical liberalism is largely based on the idea of negative freedom or negative liberty. So this is the idea that essentially you can do whatever there isn't a law stopping you from doing. Mill develops that, and he talks about harm theory, and he says essentially you should be able to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm others. He does warn against the problems of tyranny of the majority, and this comes into the idea of tolerance and equality in terms of protecting the rights of minority groups. And he talks again about this idea of developmental individualism, where people have kind of, or humanity has almost endless potential, and one of the most important things is freeing people's potential and making sure that they can achieve the best that they are capable of. And then modern liberals talk more about positive freedom, and so this is when the state starts stepping in and saying you have the right to do this, you have the right of that, this is protected, that is protected. And then we also see this fitting into positive liberty, where the state starts stepping in to help individuals overcome barriers to become free, and this is the idea of ensuring equality of opportunity, and therefore we see an enabling state. Now, there's some of the important modern liberal thinkers we've got in there. One of my favourite theories in this is by Rawls. Rawls writes about the veil of ignorance, and this is the idea where you link it into rationality, and that if people were unaware of their own kind of background and wealth and age, ethnicity, all that kind of stuff, and you said, right, what kind of society are you going to create? You don't know any of that stuff. What? Create me a society. And he says overwhelmingly people will rationally come up with the idea of a society which does everything it can to kind of create a base level of income, a base level of resources available to people, and kind of attack poverty, remove absolute poverty. And Rawls therefore says it is rational that the state should do this, because that would be everybody's choice. And so Rawls is kind of on the left of modern liberalism, I think it's safe to say. So he argues he's still basing his idea on individualism and rationality, therefore he's not based on collectivism, he's not a socialist, but Rawls will argue for things like degrees of redistribution of wealth. But the modern liberals won't attack the idea of people being very wealthy, they just attack the idea of people being really poor and therefore not having equality of opportunity. So in that way it's different to some elements of socialism. Freedom's a really important and significant writer, not only in feminism but also in liberalism. So it's about other things that can restrict people's freedom. So she talks about cultural conditioning and how that restricts the freedom of women. And then again, she underlies this idea of equality can be achieved through legal means, and so she rejected the kind of some of the more direct action in the second wave of feminism, kind of concentrating on legal methods, and that would fit with the idea of positive freedom. Right, so that's some of the ideas and things in the background. This is an example of the kind of revision technique I get some of my students to do. It's called a lotus diagram, and in that, what you do is you kind of you have the different bits, be it one of the key thinkers or a type of one of the strands of the ideology, and you just put kind of key concepts or key ideas around it. So I have a tendency to do things like this and put them on an A3 sheet. It's just a nice way to revise it. So you fundamentally, your AO1 is going to come out of this by you knowing stuff from the theories of the key thinkers. Your AO2 is going to be looking at areas of agreement and disagreement, and then your AO3 is going to be making judgments. So in terms of getting ready for the paper, so we've got videos I've then done on the source questions, on how you do those, and the important bit of that, or the bit I always push with my students, is this idea of the ideals paragraphs, where you kind of identify, describe, and then give an example, and then you directly kind of analyze and bring the argument in with the question, and you link it to an opposing argument. And then S is the biggest bit of this, where you scrutinize it, where you weigh up the comparatively whether the initial argument or the counter argument are stronger, and then you end up with a judgment in that little section about which one of those is the strongest and why. And then so you go through your AO1, through your AO2, and into your AO3. I've done videos as well looking at the different essay types, so the 30-mark questions and the 24-mark ideology questions. So again, you'll find those on the politics playlist, right near the top of that. So if you want to sharpen your technique before the exam, they should help. And then I think these I think are really important, and understanding how you are assessed is a really important bit about doing well in exams, I think. So I've done individual videos on what AO1, AO2 and AO3 are. So AO1 essentially is knowledge. So in a lot of the essays, this is examples, relevant, pertinent examples, precise detail. It's about using political terms and defining them. This is again particularly important, well, in all aspects of this, really important if you're doing something like an ideology essay and you say social contract theory, and then you don't explain what it is. You won't get as much credit if you go social contract theory, this is what it is, and you explain all those kind of bits. AO2 is about comparative analysis, so this can be agreement and disagreement. In the ideology essay, it can be weighing up a point and a counterpoint. In a 30-mark essay, when you go, well, this point is stronger than that point, and again, there's lots of things, triggers and things in your language that you should use in that. And then AO3 is your judgment. This is this politics is a subject where they are expecting you to argue a view, argue a point. That's one of the main skills that you are developing. AO3, normally the toughest marks to get, but in that you have a clear and nuanced answer to your question, and you are then going to support it with the evidence and the arguments that you're going to look at. But there is that central judgment that runs all the way through and says this is the case, and you back it up. So have a look at those. They might also help you. They're on the main A-level politics playlist. So I hope this is a useful thing in the run-up to this first exam that's coming. Again, make use of all the videos on the channel. I'm sure that they will help. The best of luck with your exams. If you haven't subscribed already, then please do so. Videos of all different lengths. I know this is a long one, but there's lots of shorter ones. And again, you can find some of those really short ones on TikTok as well. Thank you for watching.